fun cutting test and on the apple. Let's start. Okay, you can see. So this is a short African sword, and it is fun to cut with the apple. And yeah, so let's do the final cut, and then we can talk about it. Okay, so with the sword, this one, the African short sword, is that when all kind of sword have different way how to use it, this kind of thing. So you see, if you look here where my hand is, you can see it's no hand guard. That means this sword is used with a shield, because you have no protection with your hand. It's easy to be cut if you fight with this sword. So you have a shield to protect you with it. And you can see the point here, but because the sword is curved, it's much more for cutting, and it's very, very light, extremely light sword. It's like it's very, very light. So this sword is not good to use against armor, especially the armor they use in Africa is like textile armor, or like chainmail, or some places in Africa that have chainmail and plate together if they are from Islamic empires. But special thing is like cotton armor, like textile armor. And this sword is so light, so extremely light, this sword, madinga. So for me it's hard to see how this sword can be useful against somebody with armor, because it's so light. Like, you have to understand, it's one thing to cut apples, it's a total different things to cut textile. Textile is much more compact, and it's much more harder. So I think this is much more like a tribal sword that you use against other people that have maybe one shield and maybe one shield and a sword, and probably this one is a short sword, and they have maybe the base weapon is the spear or a bow. I can show you the scabbard of the sword look like this, and I think it's from Sudan. I'm not 100% sure if it's Sudan or Nigeria. I have to look it up much more clearly. But you see, this is my cat playing. You can see on the scabbard, you can see at it's a shape like a snake, the head of a snake, like here. And yeah, it's very good because when sword scabbards made of in leather, you can see here, in here. That means the sword is always going to be much more sharper and sword in iron scabbards. So, for example, not this sword, but in other African sword, when the British in Sudan fought against the Tuaregs, this is not a Tuareg sword. It's not a Tuareg sword are very expensive swords. They look totally different. This is not a Tuareg sword. But for example, it's very good to use this kind of scabbards instead for iron scabbard, because this sword is much more sharper than. And every sword from history across is made for a special reason, for a special opponent. For example, if you look at the Tulwara in India, it's special use for that kind of reason. It's like I don't know if you see the grip of the Tulwara is force you to hold it like much more like a hammer grip, like you much more hammer grip swing, or like in the Kanda, you hold it in different ways. So all kind of sword is different way how you use it. So like you can use the sword like I show you in this video, a very simple way when you just cut the eppel. That you can do with every sword. But if you use a sword with special tactic, you use it totally differently. How you uppercut, drawing cut, thrusting, and some sword are better in that thing to thrust. Other sword is better to cut. Other sword is better to punch cut. But yeah, my pearls. If it say what kind of sword I like absolutely the most is absolutely Indian sword. I think that is my. If I ever have a chance to buy an Indian sword, I will. But because they are extremely rare and extremely expensive, I think that is the top of the top when you talk about sword. It's the Persians and Indian sword. Because if you want a real Indian sword, you want a sword that made of maybe Damascus or woods steel, and yeah, they are too expensive. They are so expensive. You have to have lots of money, and you have to know persons to buy this kind of thing, because it's so rare. And because, example, in India, like for example, even the Mughal king, like the king of the Mughal, like even buy swords from other places in Europe, swords blades, because it was so much work to make wood swords, because maybe elite guard of the king and the king have wood swords or Damascus swords, but his army do not have it, because it's only for the best, only for the one who can pay the money for this blade and pay all this kind of thing. So that's the same thing for African swords. It's like 1,000 different versions of African swords. I don't know the name of them all because there's so many. Like is the most famous sword is the sorry. Anyway, sorry for that. Cascara. It's not the Cascara. It's the Cascara. Is one of them, and it's very because so this sword is very interesting how they look, because African swords are much more it's much more lifelike. It's a sword that made from nature, like, you know what I mean. They are based on like, for example, this scabbard It's the shape of a snake. And so it is. So it's very interesting how they made some sword, and lots of the sword also they take from European, like example in Indian, and of course they have sword. Yeah, so they have some have a long sword, and other swords. So it's very interesting how a sword looks. One sword is like sorry for that. Oh, I just forget. Yeah, but simple to say about it all is that when you talk, like when you talk about swords and blades, it's very you have to understand something is no sword in the world is superior to other sword because just because a sword is very popular. If example katana is the most popular sword in the world, do not mean that that sword is the best sword. That just mean that that sword is the most popular sword. It's a different thing with popularity and good sword. Katana is a very good sword, but you have if you say something sword, if you say a sword, example in documentary, you say sword is the best sword in the world, then you have to do a test with every sword in the world to compare it. Then you can say if katana can be better than all swords that ever existed, then you can say it is the best sword. But if you it's so many swords that do different things, thrust, cut, and so on, and are different shape, different length, different weight. So I think that sword is sword. Some sword you use it for one different reason in battle. So no sword is better than other sword. Like maybe some sword may so if you for example if you do a cutting test like a real cutting test, for example on bones like pigs, then you have to try other cutting sword. Example the tulwara, the shamsher, the kilik, the kanda, compare it to the katana, and personally I think maybe the shamsher will prefer better in cutting, because it's much better steel with the Damascus steel is better steel, and also then the other thing is the armor. If you really explain both like the samurai armor, and you have the Persian armor, like for example the Safavid or the Mughal armor, is also very based on both of them are very based on the Mamelukes. Probably I think, of course you don't use a sword against armor, you use other weapons like a hammer or kinabu. The samurai use a kinabu, or the Persian use, now I totally forget the name of the mace, but the mace is the mace is shaped like a bull head. It's very cool. If you write on the Google and you write Persian war mace demon head, then you find a picture, a sculpture with a human hand, a bull. It's a very cool weapon. So you use different kind of heavy weapons against armor to break through the armor or hit So I just want, and just remember this video was just a fun video. It's nothing more. It's nothing. I don't want. It's not nothing to prove anything with this sword. It's just fun thing to cut apple. It's nothing more. Like every blade should be able to cut apple. That means nothing. Apple is very easy to cut. It's super easy, and the only way when you can see if a sword is very good is if you cut, for example, sugar canes, like really hard sugar canes, or bamboo, like bamboo put in water, or like very old special trees, hard trees. Some trees you cannot cut, example African iron tree, you cannot cut with a sword, it's impossible, and then you will just damage the sword. But you can cut something that are very very hard. I don't know what is hardest, if sugar canes or bamboo. If you like, sorry, it's my cat. Um, yeah, but because I live in Europe, and it's very hard to find sugar canes here. You cannot find. Maybe you can buy somewhere sugar cane, but maybe it's easy to buy dry bamboo. Bamboo can you buy very easy if you go to like a store when you buy flowers. There you can buy bamboo that you, yeah. So, but then you have to then the sword needs to be extremely sharp, because bamboo is very hard, especially if you maybe have 8 or maybe 200 bamboo put together and try to cut through them all with one swing. Is I don't know if that is possible, but maybe if you have a really strong cutting sword and this kind of thing. Yeah, so that is one thing with the sword, and other thing is like, remember that one thing, when you cut with the sword, especially when you do this kind of videos, cut apples, remember that it's very important that you always stay safe with it. Like, always look behind you, always look forward. Do not, so nobody is running. Like, if you, example, like me, have animals, I always have to be really careful. That I always know that when I cut with the sword, I always cut the apple, and I know nobody is close to the apple. I always it's very important, because when you, this is just a test, nothing more, nothing less. And a sword is a weapon, and it can be a very dangerous weapon. So when you use the sword, always use it professionally, and always be sure, because it's a weapon. Even if it's antique, it's still a weapon, and you can hurt yourself. Some weapon, like some sword, you have to be extra careful with, because maybe it's easier to swing the sword and you cut the sword wrong way and you get it in the stomach. So always with weapons, be careful. And yeah, and some weapons is more dangerous than other weapons. For example, a sword, antique weapons like swords, you have to sharpen it to get sharp again. But example, if you buy a war mace, these kind of weapons, you don't need to sharpen them. They are weapons from the beginning, or firearms, this kind of thing. And yeah, so one, I think, that is one thing. Yeah, I don't know what is weapon. Probably, if I talk about what I think is my favorite weapons, absolutely is heavy weapons like mace, and battle axe. I really like weapons that they use in history against armor, like a really heavy axe, like you can really get a powerful hit when you swing with it. I think it's easier to buy antique swords and to buy antique maces, this kind of thing, because a mace you can use is always a weapon. You can never take that thing away with a war mace, because it's always a iron club or a wooden club or a stone club, so you always can do horrific damage when you swing it. And probably that is the reason why, like example, pole axe are forbidden in some tournament, because the weapon is used to hurt people through the armor, and you cannot blunt it. You cannot put anything on it to damage like sword. You can put something on the tip of the blade. You can clip off the top of the tip of the blade, to make it no sharp anymore. But example with warhammer, you cannot do that because that is it's always going to be a weapon. And yeah, so that was my fun, just fun cutting apples, and show something with that. And remember, this sword is not sharp. It's an antique sword. If I want to sharpen it, I have to sharpen it up. But it's an apple. Remember that it's an apple, and apple is easy to cut. It's different thing with the coconut or other much harder fruits to cut. And I don't know if I'm ever gonna try to cut coconut with that sword, because it's an antique sword, and antique swords are expensive kind of swords. And yeah, you have to be sure when you cut something with an antique weapon. You have to be sure that you know that you cut with it's not gonna damage your sword, not gonna break it. If you hit something that are very hard, and the sword have some like. I try if I can show you. I hope I can show it. Can you see? Wait. Okay, here. Sorry for that. Okay, so. Okay, right here when I put the blade is some small breaks, but it was a long time. So that means it's probably this sword maybe have used in battle in Africa, and battle in Africa. I don't know, because you see here after it's like you can see the cuts. Yeah, and you can use it different way. You can use the sword with two hands. I can see. You can see here. You hold it with two hands. One hand, shield. So probably this sword is used with one shield, because it's no hand guard. So it's no protection. You have to have a shield to protect yourself. There's no protection here at all. No, not at all. The only thing I can think about is like if you are slippery with your hand, this thing gonna stop you to sweep up to the sword and cut yourself. So that is. See. Yeah. So you use it one hand for easy swing. I think the sword is maybe probably used on horseback. It's not so long, but it's so light. It's extremely light, the sword. Extremely light. So I think you have to have something to make it get more a punch, because it's so light. So maybe because it's so light, maybe can you get so sharp? So it may be very sharp. Maybe I need it extremely sharp to make damage, do any good damage. Because if it's so light, I can see. Wait, now I have to be careful. You see that it's very flexible. Because this sword is not sharp, then I can hold it. That is the reason why I hold it like this. So that is the reason this sword is not sharp. The reason why I can cut the apple is because the velocity, because it's my arm, the sword, and the ground. Is a different thing when something is sharp and something like an axe, like heavy in that sense because of velocity, but because it's so light, and you get something is it's very light, not sharp at all. So I don't know really how they use the sword at all. I know that there's a YouTube channel called African Historical Martial Art, and they talks about African weapons. And it's other YouTube channel. I don't remember his name, but he also talked about African weapons. But if you go into African martial art historical on YouTube, you will find the channel, and they will give very much a very good explanation of African weapons. They are experts. They invite people that made swords, African swords, and there's one very interesting review when they talk with one person about the history of African, I probably say wrong now, African ironsmiths, how in the culture how they make the swords. It's very interesting because it's so few things when we know, it's a few things, sorry for that, it's a few things that we know about African sword. I know I have one African book with African weapons, but it's not in the mainstream media with African swords. It's absolutely not. It's the only swords that are in mainstream media are the katana and the European swords. Like when I say European sword, I mean, of course it's many different European sword, but you know what I mean, like the armored sword, like one two-handed sword. Because so there's very few things, like when you talk about example like in video game or in Hollywood movies, you will probably never see this kind of weapon. Maybe one time in one movie you will see this kind of weapon. I know one movie, like for example, I think the Pirates of the Caribbean, The World's End. Then we see then you can see in the gathering of all the pirates, you will see one Tulvara sword in that movie, because it's in different pirate kings. So that is very cool to see that. If you like swords, it's very cool to see a Tulvara, because it's so rare to see in movies, especially in Hollywood's movies. And the thing that is much more rare than that is to see how the sword was used in a real battle. Because, for example, if you talk, example in India, for example, and you talk about like Bollywood movies, and it's horrible movies. You never ever see a real battle thing, like how real fight with the sword, like a real tactics. It's because it's interesting. If you look at Indian weapons like the push dagger, different war maces, the chakram, the kanda, tolvara, and so on, but you never get that. It's a totally different thing. It's like Indian war are they have very aggressive weapons, but you don't get it. You never put it forward in the mainstream media. Like for example, if you talk about the samurai, you get much more about them, like in games, in movies, because they are much more good performance in video games and so on. But because you never get the same thing with like African swords or African movies with African warriors, it's always in the background. It's always behind in the background. So so look up that YouTube channel. I really recommend it. If they will give you a very good information about these kind of weapons, African weapons. And the other YouTube channels that talks about sword, I really want to recommend, is Skull Gladiatorian. He talks about European weapons and Indian weapons, and of course Chinese weapons. Yeah, and Nepalese weapons like the kukrid. Yeah, that is really everything I really want to say in this video, and yeah, hope you like it and stay safe.